Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. Welcome to the Impact webinar, Unveiling a Promising Pathway to Net Zero, the creation of a global CCUS market. My name's Aling Tang, Assistant Content Analyst at Leader Associates, and it's my great honor to be a host for today's session. The global CCUS market is rapidly expanding. It's projected to grow by 50%, reaching 420 million metric tons per year by 2035. As nations strive to reduce emissions, the focus has shifted from local solutions to international collaborations that can have a global impact. This webinar is a digital part of our prestigious physical gathering, Carbon Capture Global Summit 2024, taking place on the 3rd and 4th of September at Queen Elizabeth Centre in London, UK. This global summit unites top decision makers and industry leaders across the whole CCUS value chain, facilitates in-depth discussions on global CCUS strategy, and fosters international cooperation. Here, I would also like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our energy transition partner, Shell, Platinum Sponsors Technology Center Mondstadt, Clipford Chance, Knowledge Partner BCG, and Associate Sponsor ING Group. Thank you for your support. Our agenda today will include a general overview of global CCUS market, policy, and strategy guidance brought by leading countries like UK, Norway, and Canada. Then we'll discuss the scaling and commercialization of the storage market, and finally, we'll explore the challenges and opportunities of CCUS investment. Before we start, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared online. We encourage active participation in the Q&A sessions following each presentation. Now, without further ado, I'm honored to introduce our opening speaker, Mr. Alex Dewar, Managing Director and Partner at Boston Consulting Group, to give us a global market overview and market prospects. Welcome, Mr. Dewar. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Eileen. Really appreciate the opportunity to engage with everybody today and to kick off what is a really exciting agenda and some incredible speakers lined up. What I'll try to do in the next 15 minutes here is really just set the scene, to lay out some framing here to guide the thinking and discussion over the course of the rest of the session today, really around this question of where and how is this marketplace for CCUS developing, and what are the prospects for CCUS deployment. So starting with this, we cannot, I feel like, start any conversation on CCUS without some discussion around our overall climate trajectory, really being focused on what is it going to take to deliver on a future trajectory here that gets us anywhere close to net zero. And the fundamental point here overall is that we're making progress, but we're not quite close enough, right? If we recall several years back, the standard default assumption was we would be on a 3 to 4 degree warming trajectory by the end of the century. And now implemented policies already drive us toward that type of outcome. But what we're seeing is nationally determined contributions to the Paris process and further policy developments give us potential to deliver more toward a 2 degree pathway. And what's also becoming clear in this is that there's not just one technology. There's a multitude of technologies that will require delivering on that pathway, notably CCUS. And the really promising developments in the last several years have been across multiple regions, and you'll hear today across Europe and North America, where we are seeing policy developing very rapidly to incentivize and to promote the development of CCUS. So the trajectory is promising. We're moving in the right direction. And we, specifically on CCUS, have seen rapid development of policy to promote development of these markets and demonstration and further scaling of the technology. The challenge, though, is that we are still nowhere close to the pace that we need to see of CCUS deployment. If we think about what would be required in order to achieve a net zero pathway here, a 1.5 aligned pathway rather, we need to see a more than 100 times scaling of CCUS relative to the capacity that we have today. Now, what's promising is that we have seen a significant uptick in projects announced for CCUS. There is certainly intent, of course, driven by the policy that's coming into place to support the development of CCUS overall. Just since 2017, we've seen an 8x increase in project announcements, and that amounts to more than 500 individual CCUS projects globally. So very exciting. A lot of projects are entering the queue. We are seeing them at multiple stages. The challenge, though, is how many of these projects, and of course we need many more, will get to final investment decision to actually develop this capacity overall. And so that's really where I want to take the presentation today, is to focus on two lenses. One is really the macro lens, considering what's needed at a broad level across different countries in order to see the scaling of CCUS. The other lens is at a micro level, to think about for individual projects, what is needed to advance these projects from concept to final investment decision, to really see the dollars allocated or the euros or other currency, as well as ultimately the steel in the ground for these captured projects, as well as the transport and storage infrastructure associated with it. So let's start at the macro level. Broadly speaking, we need to see real potential here at a country level. And the two lenses that we focus on in a lot of our work in the industry is thinking about what is the cost or really the economic viability of carbon capture in different markets. And second, how mature are markets developing, especially when we consider policy, as well as things like the capabilities, supply chains, and other factors. So there's a lot that goes into this, of course, notably work that we've done with the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative and the development of our CCUS hub tool to assess the economics of carbon capture at a very localized asset level basis. But the punchline of all of this is we really see a mix of different countries here. Some have actually relatively low cost to capture initially, in part driven by the high concentration CO2 streams of emissions, largely from the oil and gas sector, things like natural gas processing, hydrogen production. And so these are legacy, oil and gas producing countries. You'll see many of the GCC countries, as well as the likes of Trinidad and Tobago, that show up as having very high economic potential for CCUS. On the other hand, though, these aren't necessarily countries that have a well-established set of policies and track record on CCUS. For that, we really then can see a number of OECD markets that have really been moving forward and have the longest standing set of activities around policy development and market development CCUS. So US, Canada, of course, here, Australia, rising to the top on that. And then a really broad swath of countries here, especially non-OECD markets, where we have CCUS as a potentially viable lever here, but less policy, right? So, for us, it's really focusing on the two extremes here. I think there's the markets that are already proceeding. We know those, the US, Canada, many in Europe, Australia, right? And then I think those that have really strong potential here, especially legacy oil and gas countries and other markets, but are sort of catching up in a way with regard to that market maturity around CCUS. So every country is in a different place is the punchline here. But there is really broad applicability of CCUS and viability going forward. But to double click into policy specifically, this is really the critical path item here. We know that CCUS really cannot be unlocked unless we have the right types of fiscal support mechanisms, as well as the sufficient regulation and clarity around developing and structuring commercial entities and partnerships, especially the regulation of transport and storage infrastructure in order to enable investments in that. Beyond that, of course, there are a broad range of other enablers, technical assistance and transfer, engagement with local communities being essential to drive CCUS projects. So the punchline here is it really takes a very full toolkit of policies in order to drive CCUS going forward. And that's, I think, the critical thing to look at when thinking about where and how markets are going to develop. I want to make a specific mention to emerging markets, though, and I know there was a couple questions on this coming in before the session today. I think we largely, of course, look to those markets that have the greatest techno-economic potential and the greatest capabilities on this as, those that are really in the leading position. So the GCC countries, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, outside of, I'd say, the traditional markets, right, in North America, Europe, and so forth. We look at these types of markets, GCC namely as the leading opportunities, and certainly CCUS is moving forward very, very rapidly there. Arguably, in some ways, more quickly than in Europe and the US, through especially a set of hubs that are developing in the region there. Beyond that, though, I think it's really important to look at again some of these markets that are have high techno-economic potential, where there's abundant pore space, relatively low cost to capture emission streams, and where they have the capacity to develop CCUS rapidly. China being a good example there. Already, I think the main thing to watch is how quickly policy is advancing, and in some markets like China, it's moving very quickly. On the other end of the spectrum, I'd say there's those markets that have more developed policy, Brazil being a good example here, but it's going to take longer for CCUS to unfold. There is, say, not the availability of pore space to CO2 emissions, and so it really takes, I think, a longer game, if you will, and engagement in order to CCUS develop. And then, we think there's really still strong CCUS potential, but it will take longer over the course of time in countries like India, where we see clear industry matching with CCUS, but there's a lot of work to be done on developing the right policy landscape. So the point here is really CCUS is broadly applicable, broadly viable around the world, but it will take different activities, different policy development in different markets to move that forward. So that's the macro level, right? Broad potential, policy being a critical driver, different countries in different positions overall. But let's turn to the micro level. And what I'd like to do in the final couple minutes here is introduce some of our thinking around what it will take to get to a successful final investment decision on CCUS projects. Because even if the policy is there, even if there's a supportive enabling environment, that does not guarantee projects ultimately get built. And what we're finding at BCG from our work across CCUS projects around the world is there's 4 common success factors that are really critical for projects to implement. And so this is helpful not only to think about from the lens of a project developer, but also where and how the market is going to develop for CCUS. Because if there are projects or assets that have these conditions or can really be enabled through these four levers here, that provides, we think, a very positive, constructive path forward for the deployment of CCUS. So, first is really understanding and managing the risks associated with CCUS development. Here what we're finding is traditional approaches around the development of assets, heavy industry or oil and gas assets, is really not viable for CCUS. That there's a very different set of technology risks, of counterparty risks, and just fundamental uncertainties around regulation, clarity, and policy. And so, for this, what we're finding is the ability of asset developers to step out of the traditional asset development mindset, to incorporate new types of partners, to work with governments more proactively, and to invest more upfront in the pre-feasibility phases to understand different project concepts. These are the ones that are moving forward, right? And they're avoiding some of these risks and pitfalls. So that's point one, is really look for the projects that are bringing in the broadest set of partners, that are utilizing new asset development models, that are sharing risk in defining some of these commercial structures in new ways. Those are the ones we think we see are moving forward in the fastest way. The second success factor is really engagement with government, right? I think we're often used to thinking of policy as something static, that government sets policy, markets react. What we're seeing in the CCUS space is it's really more of a co-shaping dynamic that's in play here, where projects as well as broader commercial entities developing CCUS assets or infrastructure are really engaging with governments in sort of bilateral and iterative ways, notably around negotiations on specific incentives, but also for the construct of the regulatory market overall. And we see vastly different outcomes here, highlighting the UK versus the US, highly regulated versus more unregulated markets in terms of the commercial structures around that. And so that's the other second success factor, is how governments and projects or commercial entities driving CCUS development interact and co-shape that environment. Third is then contracting and managing the commercial risk around these projects. Again, very different types of assets when we're dealing with CCUS. There's a much wider range of uncertainty, and thus when we think about the contracting structures around it, critical to develop new partnerships, joint ventures, commercial structures that account for that really wide range of uncertainty. And in this case here, what we would say is, often we're used to in industrial asset development, turnkey solutions, that's really not suitable in many cases for CCUS, given the degree of uncertainty around that. So again, those projects that are able to develop and unlock these new types of commercial structures will move most rapidly. And then lastly is building the organizations and capabilities that are needed to deploy CCUS. High complexity, of course, across the entire value chain here. Development and deployment of relatively novel technologies in the capture step, through development of midstream infrastructures and assets here around CO2 transport that are relatively novel, and storage. Of course, we've really just are at the tip of the iceberg in that. And so, this fits with a much broader trend we've been seeing across different industrial assets, and that is sort of growing complexity in the projects themselves, also in the social and political engagement around those projects. In the US, we're talking extensively now about community benefits, and that's very different from the past. And managing, of course, the commercial partners on this. And so I think this is the other dimension to look at. So I'll stop here, but as we go throughout the day, hopefully some helpful framing to think about, again, at the macro level, really what is going to drive the deployment of CCUS, again, that in countries where there's strong techno-economic potential, but needing that maturity and evolution of policy in particular, and then really at the micro level, considering the needs of individual assets, of individual projects to move forward here and ultimately bring together the right types of elements to drive forward, again, what is a relatively novel technology. We think one with very high potential, but certainly not without risk and needing much more innovative commercial and business models going forward. So I'll stop there. Happy to take a question or two if we've got time.
Thank you, Mr. Dewar, for starting this webinar with such an informative keynote. And now let's check out some questions from our audience. So to wrap up your presentation, what do you think are the key determinants of CCUS project success? And could you please state only 2 factors?
Yeah, so I think we covered off a little bit of that. I think number one, there really needs to be the match here between the policy environment and the asset level, right? There's a cost stack and there's a revenue stack, fundamentally for any CCUS project. And what we need to see is the revenue stack somehow be greater than the cost stack. And there's multiple ways to do that. I think we'll see over the course of the day that different policy environments are doing that in different models. But the first and most foundational is really building up that project level economics, aligning policy with the specific asset level opportunity. I think second is then really standing up the whole project organization around that. I just spoke about 4 factors that we look at that are relatively novel ways of approaching asset development, where CCUS is quite different from others. I think bringing those together and building an organization around that is what's critical. We've seen it in many cases, even though there may be an economic case for CCUS, you can align policy with the cost structure for CCUS. If there isn't that asset level organization and commercial structure that's built around the project, we're not going to see it move forward.
Thank you. And another question from our online audience, Mohammed. As we all know, utilization is an important business fact. So what is the contribution of the U in your calculations? Do you think that CCS eclipses the U in many markets?
So I'm going to give maybe what might be a little bit of a controversial answer here, which is we don't think the U is really that significant. It is important in individual instances, much more so from, let's say, carbon dioxide removal perspective, where you're aligning direct air capture with localized utilization opportunities, say in mineralization. It's important, of course, from an e-fuels perspective. But by and large, when we think of the gigatons that are needed of CCUS to deliver on global climate targets and commitments, the U likely plays a relatively small share. What we need is vast scaling of permanent CO2 storage. That's really what can be done at scale and what can have the greatest impact overall on delivering toward our emissions commitments.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Mr. Dewar, for your insightful answers. And the global development of CCUS indeed holds great promise for a sustainable future. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you all.
And now let's take a look at leading countries' efforts on CCUS development. UK has decided to increase the green industry's growth accelerator budget by up to £120 million, bringing the total funding available to support the expansion of its low-carbon manufacturing supply chains to over £1 billion. Please join me and welcome Mr. Chris Wiseall, CCS Infrastructure Fund and Commercial Integration Lead at UK Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, to share with us UK's funding boost for CCUS deployment. Welcome on stage, Mr. Wiseall.
Thank you, Eileen, and thanks for inviting us to talk today. As Eileen said, we're talking through the UK's approach to policy and funding. As I said, we're kind of looking at CCS policy in the UK and how we're going about funding it. I've worked in the CCS sort of team within UK government for just over 3 years. Prior to that, did a PhD on dense phase CO2, so have hopefully a fair bit of background in CCS, and try and pass on some of the UK government's views in this area. So if we go to the next slide. So the kind of phrase we use in the UK government regarding CCS is it is a necessity and not an option. That was kind of phrase put forward by the Independent Committee on Climate Change, and it kind of stacks up with all of our analysis that there is basically no way to net zero without CCS. I imagine lots of the people on the call today probably agree with that statement, but I think key to kind of start with that and remind us all of why we're doing what we're doing. CCS as well won't just benefit one sector, it will benefit lots of different sectors, including negative emissions. And as you can see on the graph, as we get sort of into the 2030s, that negative emissions part of the reduction starts to increase more and more, and kind of as we go out to 2050, will get larger and larger. So that's setting the scene of the UK's view, and that was published back in 2021, and I think subsequent analysis has just reinforced that view of CCS being a necessity and not an option. So the UK's geography, we feel like we've got quite lucky that with our continental shelf, we have a theoretical storage limit of around 78 gigatons of CO2. So pretty significant amount of CO2 can be stored in our continental shelf. We also have quite a lot of kind of expertise and policy experience in CCS. We'll touch on some of that experience in a moment over the last sort of 10 to 15 years as we've tried to develop the CCS industry in the UK. I was going to say, perhaps I should share my screen because I think some of the... Okay, I can't. Some of the formatting's messed up a little bit, but there's some other stats on the screen, which I'm sure you can hopefully just about read, where kind of outlining where we think the UK can offer a sort of expertise and incentives for coming to the UK and getting CCS off the ground. So this slide sort of sets out what I was mentioning there around our kind of learning over the last 10 to 15 years. So we first tried to kind of get CCS off the ground in 2007, commercial scale deployment, and was not successful. The second competition we ran was in 2015, and again, that was not successful. I think the key kind of learnings from that were around cross-chain risk. So in the previous competition in 2015, we'd kind of tried to bring a kind of single or near single entity that would manage both the capture element, the transport element, and the storage element. And so they would kind of operate and be responsible for all of the risks across the whole chain. And that, I think, was one of the key risks we realized in kind of understanding why that competition failed, was that the kind of private sector companies and projects should focus on what they're best at. So a power plant operator should focus on what they're best at doing, being operating a power plant, and not necessarily have to have an organization that can operate power plants but also manage offshore risks. There's typically, it's not common to find organizations with that expertise across the full chain. And because of these risks and the inability to kind of price those risks sensibly or at a reasonable cost, it basically became unaffordable. So following that, there's a lot of kind of review and kind of lessons learned, which we've now built on. And there's a number of summits and publications with Parliament and government over sort of 2018, 2019, and an industrial clusters mission, which was funding for clusters of projects to come together to kind of consider how they can collectively drive down and decarbonize their sectors and their regions. And so in 2021, there's the net zero strategy was published, and the cluster sequencing process was launched. So that was to identify those first clusters where we will be building transport and storage networks and the associated projects. And so that process has took us up to now, and the key reason for that was that when it works in a cluster, due to the number of projects coming together, they minimize sort of stranded asset risks, and they maximize benefits and that the economies of scale of projects all coming together. We should also point out too that there are quite a lot of emissions in the UK, not necessarily associated with the clusters. So around 50% of industrial emissions are not in those cluster regions. So we, in the future, are going to be addressing that question, and through what we call non-pipeline transport. So road, rail, shipping, how can we get those emissions captured and transported to a store? They typically are not necessarily associated with the clusters and the pipeline networks, but we need to work out a way of moving those emissions, and as well as kind of UK-based emissions, we'll be looking to import CO2 and store CO2 from across the world. So there's a bit of a map on the right for those that are know their UK geography. The first two clusters in the dark blue are HyNet and ECC, or East Coast Cluster. HyNet's in sort of around the Liverpool area, North Wales, and the East Coast Cluster is split across Teesside and Humberside. And then the following clusters, so those in the next round of allocations and negotiations, are one in Scotland called Acorn, and then another in Humberside too, which is the Viking cluster. So we've got 4 identified at the moment, but we know for the future there'll be more areas and regions and projects that need to decarbonise. If we move to the next slide. So this is a summary slide. I'm afraid the formatting's gone a little bit too, but again, just quite a few stats that summarise the progress we've made in the last year or so. So on the UK government website, we've got over 40 publications and announcements on CCS policy. With those 40 publications probably comes a few hundreds, if not thousands of pages of progress we've made. The two big sort of headline changes of last year was the Energy Act. So that was put onto the statute book at the end of the summer last year. So that piece of legislation effectively enables the creation of the transport and storage networks and the kind of funding mechanisms associated with CCS. And the other one to focus on as well is the 20 billion that was announced about a year ago, so March 2023. So that 20 billion of funding is for the initial projects, so the early deployment of projects. We want to get as much CO2 into the ground as possible with that 20 billion. And the 20 billion is kind of separated across transport and storage costs, industrial carbon capture costs, waste carbon capture project costs, hydrogen, power, so a whole range of industries. And the key kind of business model approach we are trying to take with this 20 billion is providing long-term revenue certainty to projects, so they can understand what their revenue forecasts will look like, and kind of unlock that the private sector capital through that long-term certainty. I'll touch on at the end as well what we call the CCS vision. So that is our kind of understanding or view of how we move from the current, quite heavily government-led approach, both on funding and sort of coordination, to a more market-led private sector approach. So if we move on to the next slide, this is kind of what's coming up in the next year or so on CCS in the UK. So as I discussed a moment ago, where these clusters are, they are across a range of industries. So cement, waste, energy from waste projects, hydrogen projects, power projects, and then more hydrogen projects on the East Coast cluster. So a whole range of industries. Another benefit of having a range of industries, again, reduces stranded asset risks. If we have a multiple or diverse profile portfolio of projects, then if one project falls away or there are issues with that one project, there are other projects there that will kind of keep the transport and storage network operational. And so the key kind of targets for the next stage of CCS in the UK, so we're looking to conclude the negotiations on the track 1 projects this year. So that will be a really key sort of statement of intent for the UK when we reach these agreements on final investment decisions. Had about two or so years of negotiations with really 10 commercial sector counterparties, which have been very complex and challenging, but I think it's a real testament to both our private sector sort of counterparties and the UK government's internal teams to reach what we hope to reach this year. And we've also, for the HyNet project in north west of England and North Wales, is wanting to kind of identify and bring forward the next set of projects that will take up the kind of capacity in the TNS network. For East Coast Cluster, we want to do the same on the expansion of projects. However, before we do that, we need to understand the readiness of the store. So the kind of next set of stores that will be associated with the East Coast Cluster need a bit of appraisal before we move on. I think we've somehow skipped a slide a bit early, but basically to summarize, we need to get East Coast Cluster's store expansion appraised before progressing the expansion of the project selection process. And then some other policy development plans that were just on the last slide were going to have a call for evidence on the non-pipeline transport, so how we get CO2 from maybe dispersed sites across the UK or elsewhere in the world to the CO2 stores, and we're also going to consult on how we bring in more competition into the allocation process, and some further calls for evidence on things like the CO2 imports and third-party access. So yeah, that's quite a lot we've done in the last year, and quite a lot to come, and we're looking to kind of push forward as quickly as possible on getting CCS in the UK off the ground. And the CCS vision, so on this slide, is what really comes next. So our vision is to make the UK a global leader in CCS, creating a self-sustaining sector that supports thousands of jobs and reduces emissions to ensure a better environment for future generations. So that's our kind of single statement of what we intend to do. How we intend to do that is through three phases, really. So a kind of initial phase, which we're in now. So alluding to a bit what Alex was saying, it's how we're taking a kind of market creation phase. So that involves government, but also collaboration with industry to kind of create and bring forward this market and the mechanisms associated with it. Then there's a market transition phase, so kind of first half of the 2030s, where we'll start to bring in more competition and more different ranges of projects, and kind of bring forward the private sector's involvement further. And then finally, a kind of self-sustaining market phase, kind of on 2035 onwards, is the aim, where government will have taken more of a step back, and the private sector will be delivering CCS at scale in the UK. So our kind of four ways or four focuses we are sort of using to kind of frame those three phases are how we are aligning our plans with future carbon budgets. So in the UK, we have a legally binding carbon budgets approach to getting to net zero, where we have to be compliant within the CO2 abatement pathways. So we need to ensure that our plans and industry's plans align with that legally binding commitment. We also want to develop the skills and expertise in the UK, either for new companies or transitioning skills and expertise from more traditional oil and gas sectors into the CCS sector and building a real global leadership in that area, including using our continental shelf to store other country CO2. That ultimately will underline or support the growth of the UK economy and levelling up across different areas of the UK, and typically not just in the southeast of England, but across the whole of the UK. And ultimately, the kind of, we want these initial investment to build up and develop into a self-sustaining sector that will have a reduced level of government support. So to summarise, 2023 was a landmark year for when we passed the Energy Act and announced the 20 billion of funding for the initial projects. We're looking to take final investment decisions on Track 1 projects this year. We are expanding the Track 1 HyNet cluster and are looking to do the same on East Coast clusters as soon as we're more confident in the stores. And we are also currently speaking with Equinor and Viking, so the kind of next set of clusters on how we can bring forward those projects and get those projects off the ground, and continuing to develop the CCUS vision and implement those kind of actions we've outlined into real policy and something we can build on and deliver. So that's it now. I hope there's some time for one or two questions, and I want to thank you for your time, and please do get in touch with us if you'd like to understand a bit more about the UK government's approach.
Thank you, Mr. Wiseall, for updating us the details of government efforts and support. And here we've got some questions from one of our audience. When and how do you see the CCUS market in the UK transitioning to a merchant model rather than one that relies on government for financial underpinning?
Yeah, so thank you for that. So that question really is what we set out in the CCS vision document. It was published in December 2023, but we effectively want to step away from or just always be UK government funding. We want to bring in more competition, whether that's kind of auction rounds or allocation rounds. So a bit akin to how we did the same in offshore wind and really drove down costs there. That's sort of direct competition between projects based on cost, whereas I think the current approach has been sort of direct negotiations with projects, which is definitely needed for the first of a kind nature, but obviously took a long time, and ideally we want to be quicker next time. And then I guess there's other elements is around things like non-pipeline transport. So currently the transport and storage network is kind of a regulated model, and like is there ways that other models can bring in more competition, so things through shipping or offshore competition. These are all the questions we've kind of laid out in the vision. We don't necessarily have answers to all of these quite yet, and want to kind of work with government, with industry and other stakeholders to kind of answer those questions collectively, because it's not just about government having all the answers. Like we need to work together to kind of understand how we can deliver that collectively.
Thank you, Mr. Wiseall, for your generous answer. And also, as you can see, there are still 2 or 3 questions left in our Q&A box. So we also welcome you to stick around a little longer and type down your answers. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
As we know, Norway's Climate Change Act sets a 50 to 55% greenhouse gas emission reduction target by 2030 and a goal to become a low-emission society by 2050. In the next keynote, Mr. Alexander Ein, Deputy Director General of CCS Section at Norwegian Ministry of Energy, will share with us Norway's strategic roadmap for carbon capture and storage, and how will the country harnessing CCS as a promising climate mitigation measure. Welcome, Mr. Ain. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Eileen. And thanks for Chris for a very interesting update on the developments in the UK. Norway has a long history with CCS. We've been doing CCS research since 1986. We've been injecting CO2 at the Sleipner field since 1996. The injection of CO2 at the Sleipner field was a result of the implementation of a CO2 tax in 1991, which made it more economical to permanently store the CO2 than to blend it off or to flare it. We opened the world's leading test center, thank you, for capture technology in 2012. And we're developing Longship, Europe's first full-scale project, which will start operations next year. The government's objectives for CCS are to speed up the deployment of CCS globally, to develop new green industry in Norway, and to facilitate commercial CO2 storage and CO2 capture in Norway. The government made the decision to support the Longship project in 2020. The project consists of CO2 capture from Heidelberg Materials cement plant in Brevik, and possibly from Celsio's waste incineration facility in Oslo. Transportation and offshore sequestration is done by Northern Lights. This is a joint venture between Equinor, Shell, and TotalEnergies. One of the biggest problems with CCS is the chicken and egg problem. Capture projects need a storage before making an investment decision, and a storage operator needs to know they have a customer before they can make an investment decision. So everyone's looking at each other. With the Longship project, the government solved the chicken and egg problem by taking the role as a middleman. So if the storage site's delayed, we pay for the emission costs of the capture site. And if the capture site's delayed, we'll pay for the waiting costs of the transportation and storage operator. And by doing this, we solved the problem, and we took a lot of risk as a government. But this enabled these simultaneous investment decisions to lift this first value chain in Europe and to kickstart the market. And also the government provided 2 billion euros of investment support to the project, and that obviously helps as well. And this was really necessary to get the ball rolling for CCS in Europe. And one of the key objectives of the project was that the infrastructure that we build should benefit other European countries. And you can see from the chart that there's a link to Denmark and the Netherlands. The approach has worked. At the end of March, the construction of the Northern Lights project, the transportation and storage part, is more than 90% complete. So they'll be ready to receive CO2 this summer sometime. The market interest for CCS in Europe has gained a lot of momentum. And the storage operator Northern Lights has entered into agreements on a commercial basis with Ørsted in Denmark and Yara in the Netherlands. And they will store their CO2 in Norway. And we see a lot of interest in CCS and the Longship project from governments across the globe. Northern Lights and Heidelberg, the cement plant, have visitors from across the globe nearly every day of the week. And Northern Lights have said that they are the largest tourist attraction in their area. Construction at the capture project at Heidelberg Materials is 77% complete. And the picture there shows the installation of the absorber tower where the amines are mixed with the flue gas. And this is a complex project. It's a 107-year-old cement plant. They've kept the cement production running at full capacity throughout the construction period. And this is it's a slightly delayed project, but it's still impressive in my opinion, given the complexity of the project, the age of the facility, and being through a difficult period with a pandemic and the supply chain situation in Europe over the last couple of years. The interest in CCS, commercial CCS in Europe has taken off much earlier than at least I expected. My expectation was really that when we made the investment decision for Longship, we'd have to wait until the project was up and running before we started seeing other people really showing an interest. But this is really, in my opinion, kickstarted the market for CCS in Europe. And I think the main reasons that this has been faster than at least I expected is that the governments and the EU have been more vocal in saying that we need CCS to meet our climate targets. And also the CO2 price in the ETS system in Europe has increased from around 20 euros a ton from when we made the investment decision in 2020 to around, right now it's around 70 euros a ton, and it's been up towards 100 tons as well. And that makes CCS a fairly economic proposition compared to emitting costs if you have some support from state aid from governments. We've awarded 6 additional exploration licenses in addition to Northern Lights over the last couple of years. And we plan to award further license acreage right after the summer holiday. We just an hour ago announced that we have 8 new companies applying for acreage in 2 areas on the Norwegian continental shelf. If we add up the 6 exploration licenses that we have granted, and the ambitions behind those licenses reported by the companies, we can store 40 million tons a year annually from the 2030s. And there's more to come. Of course, these are ambitions, and no final investment decisions have been made for these projects yet. In context, Norway emits around 50 million tons a year of CO2. So there's most of this capacity will go be used by other European countries. I think that the vision for CCS in Europe should be to develop a well-functioning market for all of Europe. Right now, we're at the point where the states are kickstarting the backing CCS, kickstarting the market with a lot of subsidies, state aid. With scale, we can develop more commercial, self-sustaining, point-to-point business model. At some point, when you have enough volume, you get to some point where you have the critical mass, you can develop a liquid market. So you disconnect the decisions between capture sites and storage sites. So you can have a system with intermediaries who take the CO2 off the hands of the capture sites, and they can make an investment decision without thinking about what happens further down the chain. And that's at this point where you really get the volume needed to meet the climate targets. I don't know when and at which volume this will happen, if it will ever happen, but I think it should be sort of the vision and the end goal that we're looking for. And to get there, we need things like standards for CO2 specifications. But at the same time, this is difficult because setting these specifications means that you need some experience. If you move too early, you might exclude some industries, and might be counterproductive to move too early. Finally, wanted to show a picture of what I think, previous one. What I think was a really turning point for CCS in Germany, and Germany being sort of the powerhouse, industrial powerhouse in Europe, perhaps also the turning point for CCS in Europe, when the Vice Chancellor Robert Habeck visited the cement plant, CCS project in Brevik, and this is a huge shift for the Greens in Germany, and stating that CCS is necessary to meet the climate targets. So I just wanted to conclude with that. CCS is necessary to meet the climate targets, and it's something that we should all collaborate to develop further. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ng, for the solid presentation and detailed illustration of the Launchip project, which is of great importance in the CCS landscape. And now let's check out some questions from our audience. The first one is, could you please provide one key enabler and one existing barrier of Norway's CCS roadmap?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think we have a really logical, stepwise approach. We build on what we've learned in the past. And the next step is to make CCS a more commercial and self-sustained market. It needs to be more commercial, to be self-sustained, to sort of achieve huge volumes and the mass that we need to meet the climate targets. We have huge theoretical capacity for storage in Norway, 80 gigatons on the Norwegian shelf. But I think the key barrier is still the chicken and egg issue. It's still there for the next projects. And higher carbon prices will help. But even with higher carbon prices, even with subsidies, there are coordination problems that need to be resolved, either from the market or with some help from governments.
Thank you. And the next question is, when do you think is the CCS project expected to make profit?
So the Longship project is structured so that the state backs around 75 to 80% of the cost for the phase 1 development. That's 1.5 million tons a year. The next phase will be where they need to develop the next phase or next phases to actually make some money. So that's when you really get the test. So the state sort of kick-started the initial phase, and if it's only the initial phase, it will never be profitable. So attracting those commercial customers, expanding capacity is what's required to make it profitable.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your detailed answers. As we've heard, Norway has indeed demonstrated a strong and long-standing will in realizing full-scale CCS and speed up its global deployment. Thank you so much for joining us today. And now let's continue our journey. Canada's ambitious climate targets include reducing greenhouse gas emissions at least 40% by 2030 and reaching net zero emissions by 2050. The release of their carbon management strategy is an important step forward in the country's journey toward this target. And now please welcome Ms. Amanda Wilson, Director General at the Office of Energy Research and Development at Department of Natural Resources Canada, to share with us Canada's carbon management strategy and shed light on how they are going to develop a world-class sector. Welcome, Ms. Wilson. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Eileen. Really appreciate it. And hi, everyone. Lovely to be here today and lovely to be here in such fantastic company. We work really closely with a range of players, both domestically and internationally, and certainly the UK and Norway are among those countries that we work with and have worked with over the years. So as Eileen said, I'm the Director General of the Office of Energy Research and Development in the federal government Canada at the Department of Natural Resources. We're responsible for a wide range of technologies, but we do have a special focus on carbon management technologies. And just maybe in case it's helpful, I'll just let you know that I will be using the term carbon management to refer sort of inclusively to both CCUS, point source capture, use and storage, as well as carbon dioxide removal. And today I'm really happy to be here to talk about Canada's strategy to scale up a world-class carbon management sector. So I'm going to talk about Canada's climate plan. I'm going to talk about federal supports within the Canadian government for carbon management. I'm going to talk about subnational leadership among some of our provinces, industrial leadership, as well as international collaboration. So you can go right to slide 3 if you don't mind. Elaine, just the next one. Perfect. All right. So both aspects of carbon management, so as I said, the point source CCUS as well as durable carbon removals really are going to be essential tools in meeting global net zero goals. The same holds true for Canada's own climate goals. So we have an ambitious 2030 climate plan, and in fact, an ambitious plan all the way to 2050, which is enshrined in legislation here in our country. The first priority of our emissions reduction plan is to avoid emissions whenever possible. But we do intend to leverage carbon management technologies where necessary in order to mitigate and remove emissions. So we do see carbon management as part of the broader toolkit of Canada's decarbonization pathways, which also includes a focus on things like electrification, clean fuels, and low carbon hydrogen. Carbon management is especially key to reducing emissions in our toughest to abate heavy industry sectors, such as cement, steel, chemicals, oil, and gas. Mature carbon management technologies show up across all modeled scenarios to meet 2030 and 2050 goals. And carbon removals are also expected to play an essential role in addressing residual emissions. So, for example, this scenario from Canada's energy regulator projects significant amounts of both DAC and BECCS required to reach net zero by 2050. All right. Canada has been an early leader in the carbon management space, as I'm sure many of you know. We are very fortunate to have some natural advantages. Notably, we have abundant geology, which is suitable for CO2 storage, as well as a depth of expertise by industry, by researchers, and by governments. We have a competitive policy environment and enabling regulatory frameworks. With important incentives and project supports from both the provincial and federal levels of government. The carbon management sector in Canada has already made some significant progress. We're home to 8 of the 41 commercial scale CCUS projects operating around the world today. We have point source capture rates of more than 90% demonstrated at some of our commercial sites. And we're home to a number of innovative Canadian companies who've been recognized at the international level through organizations such as the Global Clean Tech 100, where I think 13 of the 100 companies are Canadian, and the X Prize. We're also seeing some really significant partnerships and acquisitions occurring with Canadian companies. So this slide is really meant not to overwhelm you with the number of logos, but to give you a sense of the high number of firms, many of which are Canadian, working in this space, spanning the entire carbon management value chain. So from capture to transport, to utilization, to storage. We're seeing new firms created to leverage the talent and the expertise of existing industries, including the oil and gas sector. And we're seeing new partnerships and cross-sector collaborations form, which are enabling the development of carbon management hubs. So all of this leads me to say, and I know I am biased, but it is really an exciting time for carbon management in Canada. A key recent development was the release of Canada's carbon management strategy. This was announced by our Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson, alongside IEA Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, this past September. You'll see a QR code there on the screen, which will bring you to the document. If you can't get your phone out in time, you can also just Google Canada's carbon management strategy, and you'll find it pretty quickly. The strategy is a result of a couple of years of work, of public engagement. We engaged with nearly 1,500 stakeholders, running the gamut from industry to academic experts to startup firms, subnational governments, indigenous organizations, and so on. The goal of the strategy really is to set out a vision for us to realize the potential of carbon management to help achieve climate goals, both at a domestic and a global level, while at the same time growing a multi-billion-dollar domestic sector that has, good jobs. So to achieve this vision, the strategy presents a roadmap to 2050 and includes decadal milestones for 2030, 2040, 2050. And at each step, carbon management solutions continue to mature, driven by innovation and investment, and opening new opportunities to reduce and remove emissions. So as you can see here, the strategy identifies 5 low carbon pathways where carbon management is expected to play an important role in Canada. These include decarbonizing heavy industry, which obviously includes cement, steel, oil, and gas, producing low carbon hydrogen, clean power generation, carbon dioxide removal to address residual and historic emissions, and growing CO2-based industries that use carbon dioxide in products and in materials. Also in the strategy are 5 federal priorities to support these pathways. These include accelerating innovation and research, development, and demonstration, advancing the right policies and regulations to create an enabling environment, attracting investment and trade, scaling up projects and infrastructure, and building partnerships and growing inclusive workforces. Okay, so here we're really trying to give you a sense of the range of policy tools that we have in place in Canada to accelerate both the development and the deployment of carbon management solutions as part of a broader clean economy framework. So at the foundation, the base of the pyramid, as you'll see there, is a rising price on carbon and regulations to incent innovation and decarbonization investment. So this includes an offset credit system and clean fuel regulations, which provide compliance options and potential sources of revenue for carbon management projects. The proposed federal oil and gas emissions cap will also help to spur technology investments in line with net zero. We're also introducing a suite of investment tax credits to help address the capital costs of projects, which, as you know, can be significant. This includes tax credits specifically for CCUS, for clean electricity and clean hydrogen, all of which will provide opportunities to advance carbon management solutions. There's been, in particular, I think, a lot of excitement around the CCUS investment tax credit, which we expect to come into force later this spring. It will provide refundable tax credits for eligible capital expenditures and be available retroactively to the beginning of 2022. It's estimated that the CCUS ITC alone is going to provide more than $7.5 billion in support by 2030. This includes rates of 60% of eligible capital expenditures for direct air capture, 50% for other capture equipment, and 37.5% for transport, storage, and use equipment. The rates are set through to 2030, and then they are scheduled to reduce by half in 2031. And the goal there is really to incent early action in this space, because we know that these projects do take a bit of time to stand up, and we want to get them online as soon as possible. So to be eligible for an investment tax credit, the carbon dioxide must be permanently stored either in geology or in concrete. There is the potential down the road that other storage options may be added in when we have when we work with our colleagues across the federal government to have the evidence base to show that these are permanent solutions. Eligible storage jurisdictions so far for geologic storage are include Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. And we do expect other jurisdictions, other provinces to become eligible once they put in place regulatory frameworks for CO2 storage. So going back to the pyramid and moving up to the next level, you'll see that Canada has a number of tools to support strategic financing of carbon management. So this includes the $15 billion Canada Growth Fund, which is providing carbon contracts for difference among other financing tools to a range of projects, but they have made some key investments in the carbon management space. The Canada Infrastructure Bank also provides strategic financing for CCUS projects as well as for FEED studies. And finally, we have funding programs, granting programs that support carbon management. So this includes things like the $8 billion Net Zero Accelerator Fund, which provides targeted support to clean growth projects, including those in the carbon management space. And it also includes targeted investment for research, development, and demonstration, including a $319 million investment that was made a few years back that I am responsible for. So there we really do try to advance pre-commercial CCUS technologies to help ensure that there is a continuous pipeline of projects and technologies available as we move past 2030 and towards net zero 2050 goals. A final lever I think I'd like to mention here in the pyramid is the use of federal procurement. So earlier this month, we were all very happy to see our federal budget announce additional flexibility in the government's procurement programs so that we can procure carbon dioxide removals. In addition to federal measures, subnational governments, in this case our provinces, have also contributed to Canada's strong policy and investment environment. The province of Alberta has many incentives, such as its carbon pricing system, various funding supports, and its CCS hub development process. British Columbia and Saskatchewan in the West are also early movers. Both are eligible jurisdictions for the federal investment tax credit in CCUS and are home to world-leading projects and innovators. Other provinces, such as Ontario and Manitoba, are taking steps to advance regulatory frameworks for CO2 storage. And on our East Coast, Canada has significant offshore geologic storage potential. Both Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador are exploring carbon storage hubs with the ability to leverage expertise from their offshore oil and gas sectors and leading technology firms. So here I wanted to provide a little bit of a case study, just briefly, about the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, or ACTL as we call it, as you might have guessed, Alberta, and you'll see the map there. It is the backbone infrastructure of Canada's first carbon management hub. So this is a 240-kilometer CO2 pipeline that links capture and storage sites. It has been purposefully designed with excess capacity to allow for more facilities to connect to it in the future. It's currently being expanded with a 40-kilometer Edmonton connector, which will transport CO2 from a net zero hydrogen energy complex currently under construction by Air Products. And to enable more carbon storage hubs, the Alberta government continues to allocate carbon sequestration rights through a competitive process with 25 hub proposals currently being evaluated. So zooming out a bit to the global level, Canada has a long history of prioritizing international collaboration and engagement as part of our overall approach to developing the sector. We're currently a co-sponsor of the Carbon Management Challenge, which aims to advance a pipeline of carbon management projects by 2030 with a view to reaching a gigaton capture scale. Last year, the challenge assembled a coalition of 21 governments from across the globe to advance the goal, and is still in the process of signing up new member countries. We're also a member of the Clean Energy Ministerial's CCUS initiative, supporting knowledge exchange and the development of best practices in policy, regulations, and project development. We also co-lead the Mission Innovation Carbon Dioxide Removal Mission, and efforts are underway there to develop approaches for CDR lifecycle analysis, techno-economic analysis, as well as monitoring, verification, and reporting frameworks. And we are also a founding member of the IEA Greenhouse Gas R&D program, which really does relate to carbon management technologies. This is a long-standing organization that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It dates back to the early 1990s, and it really does contribute to the technical evidence base for decision makers. We're really proud to be hosting the next IEA GHG conference in Alberta later this year, this fall. I think you can Google it and have a look there, but hope to see many of you there. And in addition to the multilateral initiatives that I've mentioned, we also cooperate bilaterally to advance carbon management on a more sort of target basis, including through important partnerships with the US, with Japan, the EU, and with South Korea. And of course, we appreciate opportunities like this one to share and to learn from others as we work toward widespread deployment of carbon management technologies. So this is the last slide. And I really hope that what you take away from this presentation is a sense that carbon management technologies are an essential pillar of Canada's climate plan and our clean economy strategy, that we continue to invest in the development and the deployment of carbon management using a variety of funding tools and levers, including a soon-to-be-in-effect investment tax credit. Also hope that you're taking away a sense that there really is a carbon management ecosystem in Canada that includes industry, subnational governments, Indigenous partners, and others who are working together, forming partnerships, providing strong leadership, and getting carbon management projects built. Finally, Canada is keen to continue international collaboration to realize the potential of carbon management and achieve our collective climate goals. And I hope you'll check out the carbon management strategy, which sets out a vision and a roadmap to 2050. You can find it online, and of course, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about that or anything else. So thank you very much, and Eileen, I will hand it back to you.
Thank you, Amanda, for your kind sharing and informative speech. And here we've got some interesting questions for you. The first one is, Canada, as we know, is a co-sponsor in the recently announced Carbon Management Challenge. So the question is, how can Canada help countries that are not as advanced to accelerate their CCUS programs?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Thanks so much for asking. We're really happy, as I mentioned, to be co-leading the Carbon Management Challenge. And we do that in conjunction with 4 other countries. With the US, the UK, Brazil, and Indonesia. The number of countries participating in the challenge does continue to grow. And importantly, and I know the group has made a particular focus on this, includes a number of emerging market economies and countries in the global south. I think the CMC, certainly the way that Canada views it, is as a way to help connect governments and organizations to share knowledge, to enable carbon management policy, regulations, and project development. So I think there really is a role for countries such as Canada and others who have, honestly, more than a couple of decades of experience in the space to share what some of the lessons learned with countries that might just be beginning to explore opportunities in the space. I think the beauty is through being able to sort of have open dialogue, discussions, and help to shape the agenda of the initiative. We're really able to help target particular supports and learnings where they might most be appreciated.
Thank you. And the second question is, how does Canada plan to provide incentives for the development of new storage sites?
It's a really important question. And as I think I mentioned in the presentation, Canada is fortunate to have abundant geologic storage. I think just in saline aquifers alone, there's a capacity estimated to be over 100 billion tons. So that said, it is important to make sure that projects can be located where there are viable storage solutions. Canada, the federal government, has been working with provinces and with other stakeholders, regulators, geologists, and so on, to develop a national CCUS assessment framework. So the framework provides some open source tools to help match carbon sources, carbon sinks, and transportation options to connect them. It's really aimed at providing key opportunities to help identify low cost and high impact sites for reduction. That said, as I alluded to in the presentation, in Canada, it's the subnational governments, so the provincial jurisdictions that have responsibility to regulate geologic storage. So there is work for provinces to do in order to put in place appropriate regulatory frameworks. We do have some provinces, as I've mentioned, Saskatchewan, BC, Alberta already have frameworks in place, and there are others that are currently working to put in place appropriate frameworks. I think one of the things that comes to mind there is we know that in Southern Ontario, for example, there is a significant amount of heavy industry in the steel sector, for example, and others that would benefit from carbon management projects, but there is work to be done to identify appropriate storage options, and that work is currently ongoing, and the Ontario government is currently working on developing a regulatory framework. Maybe one last note on storage space, sort of moving across or moving away a little bit from the geologic storage side, is that there is still other opportunity to explore storage solutions, and we're investing in some of the RD&D needed to advance those. You know, we often think of saline aquifers or depleted oil reservoirs when we think of storage space, but there are other opportunities such as CO2 mineralization in mine tailings. And in fact, in the CCUS ITC, the investment tax credit that I mentioned, storage in concrete is an eligible alternative to geologic storage. So as the science evolves, we would expect other sources other potential pathways for storage to come online there as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for generous and insightful answers. We also believe by leveraging the abundant resources and expertise, Canada will definitely play a pivotal role in developing and promoting CCUS as a crucial tool to combat climate change and achieve a net zero future. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
And after checking out leading countries' performance, let's take a look at some pioneering initiatives of the sector. As is stated by Mr. Ain in the previous presentation, Norway is trying to facilitate commercial CO2 storage and capture. And now please welcome Mr. Ola Terjesen Militek, Vice President of CCS Solutions at Equinor, to share with us how they're scaling and commercializing the CO2 storage market with its CO2 Highway Europe. Welcome, Mr. Militek. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Eileen. I hope you can hear me. So, as Mr. Dewar alluded to, the broader scientific community, including the IPCC, the IEA, and more, argue that current global CCS operated capacity of 49 million tons per annum needs to increase approximately 2 orders of magnitude by 2050. That is approximately a 100-fold increase on a technology that was invented in the 1930s. A change at a scale so big that human beings perhaps never have done something similar before. The question I often get is whether that is even possible. And to answer that question, we are right to talk about commerciality, because commerciality is what is really needed to spur the innovation and scaling that is needed to get to that scale. Equinor is a major energy company with an ambition to be a leader in the energy transition. And I would like to cover some of our perspectives on how to get to commerciality for CCS. And I would do this by talking about how Equinor is working to commercialize CO2 transport and storage with a specific example, a project that we have dubbed CO2 Highway Europe. But before that, I would like to provide a bit more context. Because according to the Global CCS Institute, the portfolio of CCS projects in development today or at the end of last year, had 6 times the capacity of the CCS assets in operations. 6 times. It sounds like we are already well on the ways to reaching the 2050 needs. But unfortunately, it is not that easy. In fact, relatively few projects have been able to pass investment decisions so far, and we see that as a continuing challenge. And this is a pattern we've seen before. Because 15 years ago, CCS was in the middle of a large hype period, what I like to call the last golden era for CCS. And unfortunately, that golden era ended around 2012-13, and CCS entered into a dark age that lasted for several years. Many of the people interested in CCS today, and in fact, many of the people working with CCS today, does not know much about the last golden era and why that ended. But there are many relevant learnings, and though things have changed, we still face some of the same problems. But luckily, we have also learned relevant lessons, and we are in a much better position this time around. And even though the outlook today is better than it was 15 years ago, we still have some hurdles that we're facing to scale up CCS and make it commercial. And I'll focus on 4 of those hurdles. So first of all, the cost levels. Secondly, the lack of sufficient incentives. Third, the lack of fit-for-purpose regulations. And fourth, the chicken and egg dilemma. Several of these have been mentioned earlier today, but I would like to provide a concrete example with the CO2 Highway Europe and how we're trying to tackle that alongside developing projects. So I would like to start first by talking about 2 of the hurdles, the too high costs and the lack of sufficient incentives, because they're intrinsically interlinked. To reach commerciality, the expected income stream for operators need to be sufficient to offset the costs of developing and operating CCS projects and assets. Currently, that is the case for some types of projects in the US, but not all, and definitely not in Europe. As an industrial player, we can primarily attack the cost picture. We can develop projects and technology that can help reduce the cost of CCS, but our perspective is that that will not be sufficient in itself. Which brings me to the second hurdle, the lack of sufficient incentives. The challenge with CCS is that it is an add-on. It is an add-on to something else, and this add-on needs some sort of incentive. This need for incentive was there 15 years ago, and it is there today, but we've seen good progress during that time. Many countries have now put a price on carbon, which is necessary to get commerciality for CCS. The 45Q and IRA shows one possible way of incentivizing CCS, whereas the European ETS another. The ETS has been around for almost 2 decades, but it is only in recent years that the price signals have started to come close to where they need to be. Luckily, there are a number of additional incentives that could be used to help us get to the necessary level of income, including contracts for difference, requirements to carbon footprint in public procurement, and the possibility that there will be some willingness to pay extra for low carbon projects. But we are not there yet. In addition, we have the third hurdle, lack of fit-for-purpose regulations. CCS has yet to take off at scale, but it was actually quite close in doing so a little more than a decade ago. And one of the results of that is that some CCS regulations already exist, but they are not necessarily the regulations that we need for the CCS industry that emerges today and is slightly different to what we envisioned 10, 15 years ago. And then the last hurdle, the chicken and egg dilemma, which Mr. Eng mentioned. The Northern Lights project that we are developing together with our partners Shell and Total Energies is an ingenious commercial innovation and the first CO2 transport and storage project that will take third-party commercial CCS volumes. One of the challenges that have risen from that, however, is that separate companies need to take investment decisions on the CO2 capture and the CO2 transport and storage, giving rise to the chicken and egg dilemma. The easy thing would be to lean back and wait until these hurdles have disappeared. But as a company with an ambition to be a leader in the energy transition, we would like to be part of shaping this new industry and help make it commercial. So I would like to go back to what we as an energy company can contribute with. And to do that, I would like to dig a bit deeper into the cost picture. The cost of CCS can be broken down into the individual value chain elements. Some years ago, using the Longship and the associated Northern Lights project as a baseline, we looked at what could be done to get the costs down. For CO2 capture, we think industrialization and technology development needs to go hand in hand to get the costs down. But for CO2 transport and storage, however, we think scale is key. And we figured we needed to get to pipeline transport to really have an impact. The CO2 Highway Europe is one such project, where we are sticking our neck out and showing how a future CO2 transport and storage infrastructure centered around emitters in northwestern Europe and storage in the North Sea could be. To do this, however, we needed to go big. So the selected concept for the CO2 Highway Europe is a 40-inch pipeline from Zeebrugge and Dunkirk to the Norwegian continental shelf. It's planned as a phase development, or phase development of Eemshaven is also under evaluation, and we want to provide flexibility for other CO2 hubs. We aim for startup in 2029-2030 and to have a system capacity range of 25 to 35 million tons per annum. The CO2 Highway Europe aims to attack several of the hurdles against CCS deployment. First, it obviously does something about the cost piece. Getting to scale and pipeline will drive costs down in its CO2 transport and storage part of the value chain significantly. It doesn't do anything directly about the incentives, but it is a useful tool in describing how a future CCS value chain in Europe might look like, as well as providing a sense of security amongst policymakers in European countries that are concerned about the potential to store any captured CO2 that is captured in their home countries. With regards to regulations, there are also some advantages with this. Because having a concrete project for large-scale cross-border CCS, we fast-track the sense of urgency in terms of getting necessary regulations in place. Especially since it is putting a spotlight on which regulations are actually needed to move a concrete project forward. It can also provide guidelines on how loose or strict they need to be able to succeed with such a project. That is much easier to do when you have something concrete to work from rather than hypothetical and a hypothetical industry. And lastly, maturing the CO2 Highway Europe can help provide confidence for emitters that there is sufficient will and capacity to store the CO2 that they plan to capture. There has been a lot of interest in the CO2 Highway Europe, and we believe this can lead to sufficiently large portfolio emitters taking investment decisions on CO2 capture plans. We are working closely with the TSOs in the relevant countries to build out the necessary infrastructure, as this is not something that we do alone. This is an industry-wide effort with support from governments and regulators alike. The CO2 Highway Europe could easily be seen as a tabletop exercise or perhaps an initiative in thought leadership. But in Equinor, we don't have any ambitions to be a thought leader. So we are doing this because we want to transform the thought leadership into industrial leadership. And we're serious about this project, and we're continuing to mature it towards investment decision. So how do we get there? In summary, we think it's possible to deploy CCS at the scale that is needed. But to do that, we need to achieve commerciality. And this is unfortunately not something that any individual, any company, any industry, or even any country can solve by themselves. But CCS is a proven technology, and we should start deploying it today. We can't wait for the hurdles to disappear, but rather work with them in parallel to maturing concrete projects. And to attack the challenge related to costs, industrial players such as Equinor can help drive costs down by developing projects and building scale to get the costs down. But we need other pieces of the puzzle to be fulfilled in parallel. It will also be necessary that policymakers provide the necessary incentives for CCS to become commercial, And there will, unfortunately, be a larger need for support for the first mover projects until we have achieved scale in the transport network and see industrialization starting to bring costs down within CO2 capture. Thirdly, we need regulators to apply a common sense mindset and develop regulations that are fit for purpose for CCS and the risks associated with CCS, not any of the existing industries that we're used to dealing with. Here, having concrete projects can help us pinpoint exactly where any problems are, and we are looking forward to developing regulations in parallel with projects going forward. And then lastly, with regards to the chicken and egg dilemma, Equinor is showing through the CO2 Highway Europe project that we are willing to take risk, but we also need a number of emitters to do the same and commit together with us, providing sufficient signals for us to put the large amount of capital and resources on the table to develop projects such as CO2 Highway Europe. Thank you. I'll hand it back over to you, Eileen.
Thank you, Mr. Militek, for your wonderful presentation about Equinor's initiative and the illustration of matters around cost gaps. And based on your presentation, we've selected some questions from our audience. The first question is, do you anticipate the development of a standardized European specification for the storage of CO2?
I think there are lots of people that would like to have a standardized European specification for the storage of CO2, but I think Mr. Eng also mentioned that it is challenging to develop a standard before you actually have started to develop the industry. And if you look at it more broadly with reference to thermodynamics and different storage sites like saline aquifers versus abandoned oil and gas fields, and the different means of transport, there may be different specifications and standards. However, interconnectivity and compatibility is important to create a mature and liquid market. So we are trying to make this happen. So even though there might not be one specification, there might be a couple of standardized industrial specifications.
Thank you. And also one question from our online audience. Our audience wonder if Equinor considers merging the CO2 highway pipeline with the Norway-Germany pipeline from like Germany to Norway that Wintershall Dea as well as Equinor is developing. And I'll leave it to you to see if it's convenient to answer.
Yes, so that is on the table, but not currently concrete plans as part of the pipeline to do that. But again, what we do see is that to get to the necessary scale, pipeline transport is necessary. But as you see from the size of the pipeline and the capacity of the pipeline, it's quite a big hurdle to get there. So we are looking into it, but no decision has been made on that yet.
Thank you. Thank you for your detailed answers. And the best of luck for all the projects which contribute significantly to the net zero ambitions. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And following our discussion on scaling, commercialization, and cost, we have now arrived at our final topic. Please welcome Mr. Kash Burchett, Global Head of Carbon Removal Technologies at HSBC, to provide further insights into CCUS investment roadmap and explore the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Welcome, Mr. Burchett.
Thanks very much, Eileen. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. My name is Kash Burchett. I am Global Head of CCUS and CDR in HSBC. I'm going to try and follow those excellent presentations today with hopefully something that can keep everyone interested. I'm going to talk about the investment roadmap for CCUS, where we are today, where we need to get to, and some thoughts on how we can get there. Just before I jump into the outlook for CCS, I'd just like to briefly highlight HSBC's ambitions in regards to net zero in general. At the beginning of this year, we published our net zero transition plan, in which we outline how we believe we can achieve the goals set out in the 2015 Paris Agreement and our role in making it happen. In short, there are three key fields in which we think we can make a difference. First and foremost, we are a bank. And our role in society is to provide capital. So we therefore believe that we can have the most impact by leveraging our financial products and services to support growth in key energy transition technologies, including CCS and carbon dioxide removals. In this regard, HSBC is targeting between $750 billion and $1 trillion excuse me, sustainable investments between 2020 and 2030. Second, HSBC is set out to make net zero a central pillar in everything that we do in business. We've set a goal of net zero financed operations and emissions by 2050, with sector-specific milestones along the way. We're also embedding climate metrics into all aspects of our business model, things like risk metrics or client due diligence, governance, stress testing, etc. And we've set a target of net zero for our own operational emissions, so things like buildings, transport, data centers, and so on, by 2030. Finally, we're partnering for systems level change through interactions with industry forums like this, policymakers, civil society. This includes things like GFANZ, for example, JETP, the Energy Transition Commission, or the International Renewable Energy Agency. So look, that's HSBC's plan. Let's talk about CCUS specifically. So I'll start with the good news. After almost a decade of stagnation, the global CCUS project pipeline is at last starting to pick up. The chart shown on the left here depicts the evolution of the global CCUS project pipeline on an annual basis from 2010 to today. The units in this case are the number of carbon capture projects, and the colors represent the status of each of those projects. Now, as you can see, the project pipeline contracted through much of the 2010s, right? This is the dark ages, which Ole described in the previous presentation. But from 2020, growth began to pick up again. And in the last few years, we've seen very rapid growth. Now, not all of the projects under development will make it to operation, of course, but if they were to, this would amount to around 950 million tons of CO2 annual capture capacity in operation by 2030. That's the good news. The bad news is that despite the rapid growth since 2020, we are still some way off where we need to be. Estimates of how much CCUS is quote unquote necessary vary quite a lot between institutions, but the IEA reckons that we'll need something in the order of about 7.5 gigatons of capture capacity by 2050. And to stand any chance of meeting that goal, obviously we need to start building now to drive down those costs and create a bedrock for widespread market uptake. When it comes to CapEx, it's a pretty similar story. Current capital expenditure is still pretty low, but the project pipeline sees tremendous growth from 2025 onwards. Right now, capture accounts for the vast majority of capital that's being deployed, but transport and storage are expected to increase sharply in the second half of the 2020s. Now, whilst growth is strong today and it's going to get better throughout this decade, reaching net zero levels of capacity deployment will require unlocking vastly more private capital. The current CapEx pipeline cumulatively amounts to around $0.3 trillion between now and 2030. Sounds good, but the BNEF scenario for net zero estimates that we'll need about $4 trillion by 2030 and $11 trillion by 2050. So I think, as someone said earlier on, we are orders of magnitude away from what's likely required. By the way, just to put that 4 trillion in context, that amounts to around 7% of total energy transition funding required over the same period. So we have a mountain to climb, but growth is starting to pick up. What does the current investment landscape look like on a regional basis? Well, the first thing to note is that Europe and North America are very much leading the way in terms of announced capital spending plans, each accounting for around 40%. Asia Pacific follows behind with around 20%, and MENA makes up for most of the remainder. Now, the drivers underpinning investment vary substantially between those regions, and this is shaping both the volumes of capital being deployed and the sectors into which it's flowing. If we start with North America, most people on this call, I think, will already be familiar with the raft of measures put in place by the Biden-Harris administration to support CCUS deployment. Things like the Inflation Reduction Act and the 45Q tax credit enhancement, but also the CHIPS and Science Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and most recently, the Industrial Demonstrations Program. And we saw earlier the various federal support on offer in Canada, notably the CCUS investment tax credit. These measures have turbocharged investment into CCUS, and they come on top of a large industrial base and a large skilled pool of labor. That's especially in regards to the hydrocarbon technologies such as EOR, which are going to be relevant to CCUS. Whereas North America is taking a kind of carrot-based approach, Europe relies much more on the stick in the form of penalties for carbon emissions, principally as we talked about the EU ETS, but also in the form of mandated targets, things like the Net Zero Industry Act and the Industrial Carbon Management Strategy. It's not just sticks, though, in Europe. Funding is being made available in the form of the EU Innovation Fund, Connecting Europe Facility, and obviously national programs as well, all of which is providing capital for first-of-a-kind projects. It's critical for getting over those first-of-a-kind hurdles. Now, it's worth noting at this point that the different types of incentive structures being deployed in Europe versus America are yielding like slightly different outcomes. In the US and Canada, the level of support that's available is to some extent a function of basically how much carbon you're capturing, what you do with it. Hence, much of the investment to date has tended to go into industries which generate relatively pure CO2 waste streams and thus offer a lower cost of capture. So it's kind of the lower hanging fruit in some ways. Conversely, Europe is somewhat more focused on things like funding research into capturing CO2 from larger emitters, but with lower CO2 concentration levels. Hence, there's slightly more focus on the harder to abate sectors and on CCUS hubs as well. If we switch to Asia, the picture changes again. Here, we see a bit of a mismatch between regions which are investing in industrial carbon capture. That's mainly OECD states in the north, like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore also, and those with significant storage capabilities. So we're thinking about here Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia as well. The pattern that's emerging here is one where energy producers in the south are capturing and storing CO2 from their fossil production projects, exporting cleaner energy products to the north, so things like blue ammonia, for example, or lower carbon natural gas, whilst importing liquefied CO2 from those OECD states in the north to monetize their own storage assets. Now, obviously, the big unknown in the region is China, which has not placed much emphasis on CCUS thus far as part of its national strategy. But if and when it does, it will surely be a game changer, both in terms of capture and of storage. Finally, we come to the Middle East. Not surprisingly, the focus here is currently on lowering the carbon intensity of fossil fuel exports. But the region's geology suggests that it too could emerge as a big importer of CO2 to monetize those depleted fields for CO2 storage in the future. So if we double click on that regional sector breakdown, we can see how those different incentive structures are yielding different outcomes in terms of which sectors are attracting investment and where. So the chart on the left shows the number of capture projects in each region broken down by the sector that they're operating in. Now, as we've already noted, the US and Europe are leading the way in terms of sheer volume, and both show, I'd say, like a relatively heterogeneous mix of projects. But there are still some nuances to the picture which we can pick out. The US, for example, is a clear leader in those high concentration sectors, bioethanol, hydrogen, natural gas production, and that also reflects the country's strong energy production base in those sectors. Conversely, if we look at Europe, it's more focused on the hard-to-abate sectors, right? Iron and steel, chemicals, refining, and especially cement. Europe is well ahead of the pack with about 33 different projects operate under development compared with less than 10 in North America. In Asia, the focus is on the fossil transformation in the south and heavy industry is the north, as we talked about. And in MENA, it's almost all about the fossil fuel transformation capture. Very quickly on storage then, I mean, the US dominates today and it will continue to dominate over the next decade, with Europe and Asia accounting for about 40% between them by the mid-2030s. That growth in Asia Pacific is a really interesting story to me because that underpins the narrative that we're describing here, importing CO2 exports from the north. Okay, so look, so far we've talked about the drivers underpinning investment and how that's shaping regional deployments. But I'd like to turn now to some of the challenges specific to CCUS financing and how different stakeholders are addressing those hurdles. One of the most important factors underpinning any investment into carbon management is the extent to which government or possibly supranational bodies have recognized the role of CCUS in the energy transition. In simple terms, any investor is going to be looking for a clear signal from the government that this technology is recognized as a critical component in the national decarbonisation strategy. This might be delineated in a white paper. It could be set out in the NDC. Amanda earlier on did a great job of talking us through where carbon management fits into Canada's overall decarbonisation strategy, so where it fits in that kind of pecking order. But beyond this, sector-specific pathways and targets, they can add further clarity as well and build confidence that supports will not unexpectedly be withdrawn later on. And of course, if these actions can be done on a bipartisan basis, more's the better. A second challenge that CCUS investments face is risk sharing or risk management in general. I think one of the key lessons from the previous decade, the dark ages, is that CCUS projects carry a lot of risks, which generally speaking are quite difficult for the market to overcome on its own. For example, we've heard a lot today about the chicken egg problem. Alexander described this on his presentation about Norway's experience. This chicken egg situation between capture and storage. Basically, the risk here of counterparties potentially leading to stranded assets. Equally, on the storage side, slightly more technical risks. On the storage side, historically, it's been quite difficult for the market to handle long-term leakage risks and garner insurance against that. Now, lots of governments around the world today have actually put in place some quite generous measures to help overcome these problems. I think the UK, Norway, which we've heard about today, and Canada actually, are two great examples, or three great examples, that really hammer that home. How have they done this? Well, in some cases, it's things like assuming liabilities for storage risks after a given point in time. For others, it's availability payments, for example, to someone like a power generator, if the transport or storage becomes unavailable at some point. Stuff like that, where governments are intervening and helping to overcome these first-of-a-kind, risks, helping get that transport and storage infrastructure in place, so you break that chicken-egg problem. That's been pretty critical, I'd say, for the initial scale-up in Europe and North America, and I think it will be a similar story in other parts of the world too. That said, it's not just about government, of course. There's an opportunity here for private enterprise to step up. To stick with the example of leakage, there's now quite a few insurance groups who are actually providing off-the-shelf cover for those types of liabilities. A third issue for which CCUS faces is, of course, cost of capital. So for any first-of-a-kind technology, cost of capital is always going to be high. So today, the vast majority of CCUS projects under development are overcoming that through a combination of government grants and basically funding it through large corporate balance sheets. But this is basically a finite resource. Okay, eventually project finance will see its share of total funding increase. Key to that is the maturation of the technology itself. In that regard, modularization strategies can help. So the more that you build and operate any kind of technology, but particularly CCS, the lower the construction and technology risk, the lower your cost of capital. Another key to unlocking private capital is offtake agreements with creditworthy counterparties. As we saw earlier, how this is secured will vary from market to market, but in the long run, it will be demand-side measures that act as a key driver for offtaker demand, which in turn will lower the cost of capital on the supply side for CCUS projects. A fourth challenge that many carbon capture projects face is just simply securing access to storage. Historically, if a developer wanted to abate their emissions via CCUS, this almost always meant developing the entire value chain themselves, right? Capture, transport, storage, dramatically increasing the project risk and thus their cost of capital. Today, especially in Europe, there's a big emphasis on risk sharing through shared infrastructure, either of the sort that we saw with earlier, where it was going to be shipping CO2 around, something that's also being deployed in Asia, or risk sharing through shared infrastructure at CCUS hubs. Shared infrastructure enables economies of scale, it spreads the cost, and critically, it enables access to storage, which many smaller entities would otherwise be unable to manage. And I think the hub model is likely to prove a key springboard for CCUS deployment. But in addition to that, it's worth restating that this emerging Asian model in which intra-regional trade is connecting emitters with storage it's worth noting that, in the last 18 months or so, we've seen a flurry of government agreements between nations which legalize cross-border trade in CO2, and in some cases are actually stepping up as well for the next bit to, again, like break that chicken-egg cycle. So that's a kind of crucial prerequisite, I'd say, to this. Finally, the long-term economics of CCUS, as I say, will depend upon the demand for decarbonized products. Policy measures incentivizing investment into first-of-a-kind supply assets are essential, of course, but again, this is a finite resource, okay? Moves towards public procurement measures, or better still, carbon intensity thresholds for end user products, they can play a crucial role probably beyond 2030. We're already starting to see it beginning to emerge, in certain places like Europe with the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and in parts of America. So maybe California's requirement that by 2045, all cement sold must be net zero. That's going to generate demand for low carbon end user products, and in turn support scale up of CCUS. I think there's one other feature of the investment landscape that deserves some special mention. That's the interest rate environment. So the chart on the left just illustrates how far the cost of borrowing has risen since the middle of the last decade, especially in the US and Europe. Now, the impact of higher interest rates on CCUS projects varies quite substantially between technologies and depends on a very broad range of other factors, things like the firm's net gearing position, whether or not the cost can be passed on to end users. And that's shown in the chart on the right-hand side, which sets out the impact of a 5% increase in the cost of debt on a project's levelized cost of capture, all of the things being held constant. Now, clearly, there's a limit on what a firm can do in the face of supply chain disruptions, inflation growth, and resultant interest rate hikes. But there are a few responses which we've seen from the market over the last year or two. One of these we've kind of touched on already. The majority of the investment coming today is from large corporates' balance sheets, which are partly insulated from these interest rate hikes. In particular, the oil and gas sector, which has a natural appetite for this type of technology in the first instance, is very well positioned to continue financing CCUS, having been through a period of deleveraging, right? So net debt for the 25 largest oil companies has fallen to about 150 billion in 2023 from about 390 billion in 2020. A second trend that I pick out is an acceleration in design towards smaller, more modular capture units, which occupy a smaller footprint and lower the overall capital intensity of a project. To be sure, this was to some extent beginning to pick up anyway, as the CCUS business models in some locations evolved away from the kind of vertically integrated mega projects and towards the kind of CCUS as a service model. But the higher interest rate environment is definitely adding impetus to that trend. Last thing I think that's worth noting is that the impact of higher rates will to some extent depend on the market in which the asset itself is located and the scope for pass-through. Alex mentioned in his opening presentation that whereas the UK model essentially requires negotiations between the developer and the regulator, other markets like the US or Australia enable some pass-through of the cost to consumers in various ways. So the approach that firms will need to take when seeking to mitigate those higher borrowing costs is obviously going to be shaped by those regional dynamics as well. So to wrap up, the CCUS investment landscape has improved dramatically over the last 5 years. Capacity and capital deployment are surging, but we remain far from where we need to be if we're going to hit those Paris Agreement goals. We are entering a multipolar world when it comes to the types of CCUS incentive structures and the resultant business models being utilized to deploy CCUS technologies. These regional investment dynamics reflect not just individual government choices, but also things like geography, resource endowment, and quality of inputs like skilled labor. The regional dynamics also shape the response to the challenges inherent to financing CCUS, but there are a couple of solutions which are almost universal in their relevance. The importance of off-takers, clearly defined roles for CCUS in national transition strategies, assured access to transport and storage infrastructure. These are the crucial prerequisites. And then finally, the current era we're in of higher for longer interest rates underscores the long-term importance of demand-side measures to support low-carbon end products. Support measures have mainly been a supply-side story to date, as we talked about, but this is a limited resource, okay? Eventually, it will be demand for low-carbon products which allows CCUS to stand on its own 2 feet. With that, I will pause and I'll pass back to Eileen, hopefully for some Q&A.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett, for your enlightening and solid speech with a detailed illustration of the hurdles and solutions in the sector. And now let's check out some questions we selected from our audience. The first one is, what do you think are the primary challenges that need to be addressed in order to encourage more final investment decisions in the field of CCUS?
Okay. I think the challenges that will need to be addressed have evolved and will continue to evolve over time. I think initially it's been a question of simply getting the technology to work, right? So the slide I showed earlier, which saw the global project pipeline contracting, the dark ages, that was in large part, that contraction was a function of technical challenges and failures. It wasn't just that by any means. But you know, these sort of technical setbacks, they cast doubt among policymakers and they undermined public perceptions of CCUS as a key tool in, you know, achieving the energy transition. I think we've come a long way since then, but we're still really only just setting out as an industry. So getting the technology right early on is critical to ensuring that we have a kind of social license to operate. That's one. Second, I think it's crucial that policymakers continue to work with industry to identify where the show-stopping risks are and how to overcome them. Again, as I laid out earlier, we've seen a lot of progress in that regard, but the challenge, it never goes away, right? I mean, a good example is something like 45Q. You know, 45Q is one of the most generous regimes in the world, but we've still got industry leaders in the US currently standing up and saying that, you know, it's insufficient in the face of, you know, higher costs and higher inflation. I'm not saying that the answer is for government to simply just throw more money at the problem. Rather, you know, we need to work out effective risk-sharing mechanisms so that different firms at different points in the chain are positioned to manage the challenges that they have specialized capabilities in. This is ultimately what successful risk management looks like. And I think, you know, as opposed to just one party assuming everything. And then lastly, I think, you know, the last challenge to, I mean, not the only challenge to address, but one other I draw attention to is I think innovations in business models will continue to be essential. There's a huge appetite within you know, the lending community for business models that go beyond merely cashing in on government subsidies or a single revenue stream. So, for example, some firms in the engineered carbon removal space, they're now seeking to combine electrochemical CO2 removal processes, so DAC or ocean removals, with industrial production of other products like green hydrogen or desalinated clean water, or even building materials, right? So in generating revenues from those activities, they can dramatically lower the cost of the CDR credits that they're selling, boost their sales. It's a tangential example. I know we're talking about point source over CDR here, but I think the same opportunities are arising in the point source sectors. So integrating carbon capture with some of the utilization technologies, that can de-risk a project substantially.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. And the second question is from our online audience, Ali. So in your opinion, why is the transport cost expected to increase so much in the future?
Why is the transport cost expected to increase in the future? I mean, transport costs are kind of a function of your upfront capital costs and the distances involved. The type of technology that's appropriate is going to obviously, you know, alter depending on how far you are from, you know, between capture and storage. In some cases, it will be, you know, economical simply to put it on the back of a truck and ship it, you know, on road. But clearly that comes with A, emissions drawbacks, and B, on a per unit basis, that's very expensive. Over long distances on land, pipeline comes into its own, and then basically over a certain threshold for over national borders in the sea, then ocean-going ships become necessary. I'm not sure I'd say that transport costs will necessarily continue to rise. I think that once you overcome those initial capital costs for developing A, the infrastructure, and B, like the chains, the business chains, costs are going to come down quite dramatically. You look at somewhere like, say, Northern Lights, for example, or some of the models that we talked about in Asia. We're already seeing CO2, liquefied CO2 ocean-going vessels being launched, right? These are no longer just being talked about. These are actually up and running. the more of these things that get built, the lower the cost, the upfront cost of building them will go. And once you kind of overcome that, the incremental additional cost from longer distances is very small. The marginal cost of an additional, whatever, 1,000 kilometers or something is relatively minor after the, first 1,000 or so. The last thing I'd say also, just on the topic of transport, is that, again, I'd point to the role of CCUS hubs here. The more we can leverage shared infrastructure, the lower those costs will be for all. And it's worth noting that a hub doesn't have to be like a self-contained unit in a small geographical footprint. Quite often, if you look at like Porthos, for example, the German connection there, the corridor pipeline going all the way inland, it's going to be connecting 30, 40 different emitters. Same thing goes for like Go CO2. In France, they're going to be the pipeline is going to go all the way inland and connect with multiple emitters there. It doesn't have to be located just at the port. So that shared infrastructure means that transport costs ought to be coming down over time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for insightful and detailed answers. We all share the hope that policymakers and the industry as a whole will collaborate and think of innovative solutions for public-private investment, guiding the dynamic market towards net zero. Thank you so much for joining us today. And now we've come to the end of our webinar. Once again, I want to express my profound gratitude to our esteemed speakers, Mr. Dewar, Mr. Wiseall, Mr. Ain, Ms. Wilson, Mr. Militek, and Mr. Burchett. Thank you so much for sharing us so many invaluable insights. A sincere thank you also extends to our valued audience for your participation. Regarding today's video and presentation slides, we'll share them both on our official website on LinkedIn page and on our YouTube channel next Tuesday, along with some key takeaways from this webinar. If you have any further inquiries, please don't hesitate to reach out to me at aline@carboncaptureglobalsummit.com. Last but not least, I would like to remind you that this webinar serves as a virtual preview of our in-person event, Carbon Capture Global Summit 2024, scheduled on the 3rd and 4th of September at Queen Elizabeth Centre in London, UK. As today is the last day for the 35% discount, we encourage you to grab this chance, secure your delegate pass, and be a part of this world-leading summit. We eagerly anticipate the opportunity to meet you in person and engage in fruitful discussions. See you next time. Take care.